So welcome everyone. So happy to have everyone here today. It's really awesome. We're excited. I'm excited. And so this is National Drive Electric Week. Our event is, shh, I hear you, Will. My name is Beverly Deschaux. I'm the president of the Electric Auto Association, and that person who's whispering in the background is Will Beckett. He's our vice president of the Electric Auto Association. He'll be one of our presenters. But I need to acknowledge our sponsors. We are sponsored by the Electric Auto Association at the national level. We are sponsored by Plug in America, who did the lion's share of the work and did an awesome job of, the word of the year is pivoting from in-person events to online events, and we're all still learning. Please forgive our whatever our shortcomings are going to be when we're presenting here. We're all still learning. And for the Sierra Club, and our national electric vehicle sponsor is Nissan, and Clipper Creek is the charging station who is our national sponsor. So this is called EVs and solar batteries when the grid goes down, V2H, V2G, VPP, virtual power plants for sustainable home and grid. It's a long one, huh? Anyway, we're very happy to have all of you here today. And would you, in the chat, write your name and where you're from, and maybe what affiliation you have. If you're with a national or one of the organizations, put that affiliation. And so here's how it's going to go. We're going to have Will Beckett present on his setup in his garage of his vehicle to home, how he powered his home for 3 days with his Chevy Bolt and only used 20 miles worth of battery. And next we will have Michael Mora, and I will give more detail when each person comes on about who they are. Michael Mora will present on his battery setup from his solar system. He's a solar professional. Tom Gage will talk about his experience with V2G, vehicle to grid, what he has already experienced in his professional life, and what he sees as some of the challenges to having it be accepted, and maybe some of the coming technology. I'm not sure if he'll present on that. And then we have Dr. Jose Torre Bueno, who will present about the virtual power plant, how we will aggregate EVs and solar batteries to create a virtual power plant and actually keep us from having to put up a whole new power plant or having to pay lots and lots of money for stationary batteries. So Will is the vice president of the Electric Auto Association in the Central Coast of California, and he started this chapter back in 2005, having come from the original chapter in Silicon Valley, what's now called Silicon Valley, but at that time was Palo Alto. And this is his seventh, can't hear you, Will. This is his seventh electric vehicle. So he has a lot of experience with it, and he put this rig up in his garage all by himself. So Will, unmute yourself.
I'm going to try.
Great.
There we go. Everybody hear me okay? Hello.
Oh, sorry, one more thing. Excuse me. One more thing. If you have any questions, put them in the chat, and we'll get them answered at the end. Thank you. Go ahead, Will.
All right. So thank you, Michelle. Michelle, my trusty assistant, is going to help me out today. So let me talk first about what we're going to cover. Basically, when I first had an electric car, I had an inverter in it, and I had two power pack to 12-volt inverters in my car, so that, or not inverters, DC controllers to allow me to have a 12-volt supply for all 12-volt stuff in the car, and realized that if I had enough power there, that I could put in a an inverter to allow me to do AC stuff. And what I used to do is play videos and had a TV for events and things like that. And so that actually gave me the idea, along with some other people that had bolts, reminding me that that's something I did. So what I did was I basically purchased an inverter. It's a 2400 watt inverter, and I hook it up to my 12 volt battery. And the trick there is to make sure that you constantly have power to it, like you would, for instance, a generator in a car, like driving it all the time. But the advantage to the electric car is that you leave it on and it's not making any fumes in the garage, right? So that's basically what we're going to do. We're going to connect that inverter to my connections in the house. I don't like extension cords all over the place. I know a lot of people who do this, just run multiple extension cords to the refrigerator and various things that you want to power. I decided that long term, I would probably have a battery backup system. So it was important for me to have a sub panel, and it was convenient for me to do. And I'll show you that in a minute. So first of all, let me whip the camera around for you. And you'll see what I'm seeing. That's the inverter. And I connected to it a 50 amp plug, like that. And that mates up to what's in the car, which is conveniently right here because Michelle opened the hood for me. Okay, so that's where we're going to start. I'm going to hand this to Michelle, and she can just point it at me while I'm doing things, and we'll go from there. Okay. So the first step in the operation is that when the power goes out, I have to turn the car on. That's a little tricky. You have to find out with your car how you can make it so that it'll stay on when you're not in the car. And with the Chevy Bolt, it's simply a matter of turning it on and putting it into neutral. So, yeah, can you see that okay? All right. So basically, hold the button down, turn it into neutral with the door open in this car. And then once I do that, if I get out and shut the door, it stays in neutral and that beeping stops. All right. So that's the first step. Then we grab this inverter. Yeah, I can turn that off too. Yeah. Okay. I grab the inverter. And this is the part that literally is shocking, because if the inverter hasn't been plugged in for a while, what happens is it makes quite a spark. So don't be alarmed by that. The advantage to having plugged is that it's not as scary as if you were hooking up these individual cables, okay? So we'll go ahead and do that connection. And you didn't even see the spark, which is good. Okay, and then the next step would be to connect the cables. So we'll connect the plug from the extension cord into one of the outlets. And I haven't turned it on yet. And then we're going to connect this end to the wiring that I have going into the sub panel that I created. Okay, we'll see that sub panel in a minute. Important for people who are electronic will know that sub panels are basically 240. They have two sides, 120 on each. And because we're giving it 120, we're actually only powering one side of the sub panel. And I'll show you that in a bit. Okay, so plug that in. That's all connected now. Okay, basically it goes through the wall to the sub panel. That's good enough. And then this is the main panel. This is the sub panel. Main panel, the first thing you do, even if the power has gone out, is to make sure No, don't ignore that. Make sure, and by the way, I'm not going to cut the power, otherwise I'll lose my Wi-Fi and you won't be able to hear me anymore. So basically I cut this, which will disconnect the sub panel and the power from the house to the sub panel. Okay, so this is the line that goes to the sub panel from the main panel. This is sub panel. This is that wire that we just connected with the extension cord. And then what I would do is turn this on after I turned on the inverter, which is of course off right now because, again, we don't want to cut the power and switch over because you'd lose the Wi-Fi. And that's pretty much it. And then what this does is this is powering the refrigerator, the blower for the furnace, some lights, and my computers, which have UPS backup, so they would stay on until I get all this done. And also TV, so we can play videos and stuff if we want to while the power's out, which when we were out for 3 days, that was very handy. So let's see. That covers it pretty much. So this is a 2020 volt. I started doing this with my 2017 volt. The other thing that I wanted to say, which I think is kind of important for people who are really interested in doing this, I actually wrote a little piece up that goes into more detail and has better pictures of this operation that you can find on my website. It's BeckettPCS.com. So Beckett's with 2 T's, PCS as in PC Solutions.com. And go to other links, and you'll see it listed there with the other articles. I had some road trip articles that I did that are out there as well. And it has more pictures and shows you in detail how you connect it up and things like that. So that's pretty much it. So what's that?
Great,
turn
thanks.
signals.
Am I unmuted? Am I unmuted?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, thanks, Will. Do we have any questions? I'm not sure whether to wait till the end. If there are just a couple of questions, maybe Will could answer them right now while he's by the car.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, did some questions come in, John?
This is Charlie from Florida. I was wondering what that white block is under the inverter, Will.
That is a piece of foam to keep my inverter from scratching the plastic.
Good idea. Thank you.
We have a question from Gary Hall. Is there a risk of accidentally energizing the grid?
Is there? Oh, wait. Not as long as I hit that first switch I showed you in the main panel. I also, because I have a solar system, I do have a disconnect that I could hit if I needed to. But as far as I understand it, that first switch, of course, Michael will be able to answer this or not, but that first switch that disconnects the sub panel should be sufficient to keeping it from going back into the grid. Besides that, it's only 10 amps too. So.
There was another question. Did you see that somebody wanted to know if it would invalidate the warranty on the battery? That's always what we want to know, right?
Yeah, we're hoping that GM isn't watching this. I don't know
GM spy here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I've ever seen anything in the contract that says you can't use the 12-volt battery as you would in your car. For instance, if you're jumping another car, you're going to use the same amount of energy, if not more, if you were using it with jumper cables to jump, a gas-powered car. And so it really isn't any different than that. I think I'd have a good argument anyway.
Except that you're also keeping your car going so that it's actually essentially taking from the battery pack as well.
Well,
not directly.
Yeah, well, that's you'd have to do that with a normal car. So if you were jumping somebody, if you had a gas car and you were jumping somebody's battery, you'd have to turn the car on to keep the generator going instead of just using the 12 volt by itself. Otherwise, it wouldn't have enough power to be able to crank another car. So we're doing the same thing. We're basically turning on the power engine motor in order to keep the 12-volt battery from driving off in voltage.
Beverly, I can speak to the question about inadvertently putting energy onto the grid. If you were concerned about that and you have the two breakers that he turned on the same panel, you can buy mechanical interlocks that would prevent both breakers from being on at once. So you would turn one breaker, shift the interlock, and then turn the other breaker. So you couldn't do it even if you made a mistake.
Right.
So in his case, he has to remember to turn one breaker and then turn the other. But if you're really paranoid and worried that you'd forget, you can get mechanical interlocks you can put on a panel.
Right. Right.
Will, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
So two questions, actually. One is, how many watts is the inverter?
2400.
$2,000.
2,000.
Right.
So if you've got a 50 amp connector at 12 volts, isn't that only in the order of 600 watts?
Correct. It's I should have shown you. I have this handy dandy clip-on amp meter that I can actually clip on here and see. It's not going to read anything right now because it's off. But if I wanted to, I could monitor the amount of current that's actually coming from the battery. The most I've ever seen is 60 amps.
Okay, so, and also it looks like the cord going to the sub panel isn't that beefy.
Yeah, it is. That's a number 10 gauge.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No, I understand. I've been driving electric cars since 1994. I know how to make big cables. So.
Okay, so but you say you've got 60 amps pulled through a 50 amp connector.
No. Let's go dive back a little bit. 60 amps coming from a 12 volt battery. That's 10 amps going to 120 volts AC.
If you want to pause this to watch the movie.
I thought you said the DC connector was a 50 amp connector.
It is a 50 amp connector for DC. I'm actually overcurrenting that a little bit because that's going to a 12 volt battery. It doesn't even get warm when I start to use it. Okay, so
Great.
But then the AC out is no more than 10 amps, which is why I have a 10 amp breaker on the sub panel.
Right, understood.
Okay.
The second question was the system that charges 12 volt battery. How many amps or watts can that handle from the main battery?
Grand question. Have no idea, and I'm sure GM will probably not tell me. Again, if we were jumping another car, well, the automotive people might know the answer to this better, but my guess is it would be pulling a lot more than 60 amps to crank another car, at least momentarily, which is why you want to turn the car on when you're doing that anyway, because it's going to be drawing a lot during the cranking of another car. I would, I'd rather not answer that question. I know I pulled 60 amps out of it. Nothing gets warm when I do that. Also, keep in mind that in this fuse box that's under here, there are a lot of 30 amp fuses in here. Let's see if I can pull it up.
So after this, we are going to move on to Michael. So finish up this, and we'll move on to Michael.
Yeah, I can't. I'm not able to get that off right now. But as you know, there are fuses throughout a car that are multiple 20s and 10s and 30s. My guess is if they were all pulling at the same time, it would be pulling like 100 amps or something like that. So I don't feel that I'm in danger of over. Plus, it would get warm if that were the case. One of the things you want to do after you've hooked this up and had it running for about an hour or so is come out and actually put your hand on the cables. See how warm they're getting. If they're getting sufficiently warm, or this is getting sufficiently warm, which is the actual battery terminal, then you're probably overdriving it.
Thanks,
so
Will.
this is the
Thank you.
secondary.
Excuse me. Who's saying? Is that Michael?
No, this
No.
is Rumi. I had a
Okay.
question. So
Excuse me. We're going to have we'll take some more questions at the end. We're going to move on now just to make sure everyone has time to do their presentations, and there should be time at the end where if there are more questions we can ask. Did you want to say something else, Will?
Yeah, Beverly, let me just give one to that. Let me give my email address. I gave you the website, which is beckettpcs.com. If you put will@beckettpcs.com, you can go to that email, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end as well. Thanks,
right.
Will, and thanks, thanks
Michelle.
participants for your questions.
Right.
Okay, so now we're going to have Michael Mora. Michael is a solar professional, and he also has been a longtime member of the Electric Auto Association and one of the original Toyota RAV4s that didn't get crushed, which is one of his claims to fame. And when we would do in-person events, Michael would always set up his solar cooker and make solar chocolate chip cookies, and I had to fight the children off to get some. So he's a supporter of Solar Cookers International as well. So Michael's going to tell us about his battery setup that he has for his backup from his solar system on his house. And I don't know how to get you up. You'll have to get you up instead of Will to do your screen share. Click your screen share. There we go.
Desktop.
There you go.
Hot ziggity. Hi, everyone. Michael Mora here. So where we live is a heavily wooded area. And about 5 years ago, we just got sick of being without power every time there was a storm. And now it's even worse with the PG&E's public service power safety shutoff events. So anyhow, 5 years ago, I decided to put in a battery backup system. We do have a solar electric system that's grid tied, and grid tied solar electric systems, when the power fails, when the utility power fails, they shut down. That's just an IEEE requirement. It's a code requirement. It's a safety requirement. But if you have a way to charge a battery, for example, and this big box down here, if you can see where my cursor is moving, is a 1,200-pound battery pack, and it feeds power to this inverter that makes AC power, regular AC power, which in turn feeds this critical load panel. And our critical loads are refrigerator, freezer, our booster pump, which is a 240-volt booster pump for our, boost the water pressure for our house, an upstairs bedroom, and an office. So when the power fails, this inverter turns on automatically, just within a fraction of a second. When the power is available, then power comes from the utility and just goes through a relay inside this inverter and just goes directly to the critical load panel. And again, to repeat, when the power fails, a relay inside this battery inverter switches and power comes from the inverter, and that feeds this critical load panel. So I do have, however, a couple of different ways of feeding the battery when the power fails. And I'm trying to find that slide. I think this is it here, yeah. So one of them is from the small grid-tied system. I have a larger grid-tied system, but this is a small 1,000-watt grid-tied system with microinverters. In other words, a little microinverter on each solar panel, which feeds this critical load panel here. You can see where my cursor is. And when the power has failed and this inverter is making AC power to this panel, it also says to these inverters, grid-tied inverters, that, hey, there's something like a utility power available, a utility alternating current signal, And so it synchronizes the power output of these microinverters synchronized with the power being made by this battery backup inverter. And I'm either using that power to either charge the battery and or feed the loads in the home. Another picture here I want to show. This is my first battery. It's 1,200 pounds. It's 12 100 ampere hour 12 volt batteries wired as in three series strings to make a 48 volt battery. If I had a lithium ion battery equivalent to do the same thing that this does, it would weigh about less than 100 pounds and be about 1/3 the volume. Let's see here. One more picture. Where is it? Well, any questions at this point?
So what's the cost, Michael? What did you pay compared to approximately compared to what you would pay for a Powerwall?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is the equivalent of a Powerwall, and Powerwall is maybe it's a good thing and maybe not that a brand name has become a generic name, rather the way Hershey has become a generic name for all chocolates. There's a lot of other companies who make the equivalent of a Powerwall. There's companies like Sonnen, Simplify, Outback, Q-Cells. A whole bunch of people are jumping into the market now at various price points and with various performance characteristics. So before jumping into a Powerwall, you might want to look at some of the other alternatives. One of the websites to look for just a nice handy list of alternatives would be a company called Solark, SOLARK.com, SOLARK. And if you tunnel down on their website, they've got a chart comparing their product to a whole bunch of other similar products, including Tesla. That should give you a handy shopping list of companies to look for when you're talking to an installing contractor to put in a system for you if you are interested in a battery backup system. So the equivalent, if I were to have the equivalent of, say, a Tesla Powerwall for my system, I'm probably looking at $15,000 before federal tax credits and before California's self-generation incentive program rebates. This system here cost me out of pocket, I'm going to guess, with between about $4,500 for the batteries and about $2,000 for the inverter. The other stuff, the battery box, the electrical panel, this switch box here, and so forth, were relatively inexpensive, and I didn't count my own labor in that. If I would have done this for someone else, I probably would have charged a few $1,000s for the installation.
Michael, some people have asked us already, what is the name of the device or the switch or whatever that would prevent your battery power from going back into the system? I guess much like Will's.
Yeah, Will doesn't have that. That's a function, an automatic function inside the MagnaSign inverter, so that when utility power is available and just passing through that relay inside of this battery inverter and going directly to the critical load panel, that relay just stays in a position that the power is just going from the utility into this panel. When the power fails, that relay switches, and when this inverter turns on and it becomes the source for this critical load panel, it prevents any power from going back into the grid. And that is a code requirement, and it's not something to be cavalier about. I'm an electrical contractor, and as a licensed contractor, I have to go by the letter of the law.
Okay, do we have a couple of questions before we move on to the next person? Are you done, Michael, or do you have anything more to say?
I'm done unless there's any other questions.
Okay.
Michael, can you charge your battery off your solar panels?
I haven't shown all the pictures, but I have three solar setups, or three solar arrays. There's a small one here that connects to this critical load panel. I have another one that is a DC input, another smaller solar electric system, panel system that feeds power directly through this black box here, this charge controller, and feeds the battery. My main solar electric system, my grid-tied system, which is a 3,800 watt sun power system, will not synchronize with my inverter. Its sun power does not play nicely with others, and I have beseeched them endlessly, they and a whole bunch of other people in the industry, and I cannot find any way to get my sun power inverter to synchronize with my battery inverter, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Thank you.
So thank you. We'll have some time at the end if there are some questions that you come up with that we didn't pick up in the chat there. And we'll go on to, thanks, Michael. Thank you. It's a great presentation. So we'll go on to Tom Gage now. Tom, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Great. So Tom Gage is the former CEO of AC Propulsion, which made the first T0, which it was the precursor to the Tesla. And they, correct me if I'm wrong, they made up some of the technology, maybe you could mention what it is, and then licensed it to Tesla. And sometime after that, between 2010 and 2015, Tom also had his company called EV Grid, which I see he's got up on his thing there, and worked with some major auto manufacturers on V2G technology. Yes, V2G technology. And he's going to tell us about that and what are the current to being to the adoption of that. What is stopping us from adopting that now? And perhaps even some of the people who are doing things with that. I don't know if you're going to talk about that. Some of the people who are doing some V2G things right now, and what technology is coming up. I'm not sure if that's all that you're presenting, but we'll know what he's presenting in just a second. So let us hear from you, Tom. Thanks.
Hey, thank you, Beverly. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Good, okay. Yeah, I want to talk sort of big picture today about V2G, and particularly with respect to the state of California. Maybe to follow up a little bit on what Beverly told you, I'll give some background. When I was at AC Propulsion, we developed a drive system we called the Gen 2, and it had a feature where it had an integrated charger that was basically part of the inverter. They were the same electrical components, and when the car was driving, the inverter took battery power and converted it to drive the motor. When the car was plugged in, the same electrical components under the hood took the grid power, the AC current from the grid, and converted it to DC power to charge the car. So the charger was built into the drive system. And partly as a result of that construction, it was easily made bidirectional. So the charger could take power from the grid to charge the battery, and it could just as easily take DC from the battery and convert it to AC and feed it back into the grid, or operate as a power supply and feed it into any kind of an AC load with its own 60 hertz frequency. So in playing with this, we started figuring out that, yeah, we could feed power back into the grid, and we started calling it V2G for vehicle to grid. But within a year, we changed the name to V2G, as it's called now. And the reason we did that is it was 1999 and everybody was talking about Y2K. So this tells you that this has been around for 20 years, and we had it working pretty well back then. I should mention that the drive system had a very robust anti-islanding feature, which is the feature that doesn't allow the system to feed into a down grid. As soon as the system detected that the 60 hertz frequency signal from the grid was lost, it would shut off within a couple of cycles of 60 hertz and prevent any kind of backfeeding or islanding. So that part of it was handled pretty robustly back then. And in the ensuing 10 years or so, we started working with a lot of people, including some people at University of Delaware, where Professor Kempton is sort of the world's expert and chief guru of vehicle to grid. And we had some programs where we actually plugged cars in, worked with the utilities out in Delaware, and got paid for providing grid support. It amounted to something like $300 a month in some cases even more. So there's real money, there's real value, it can be done. But here we are 20 years later and it's still not really happening. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. There are good reasons for that, or some good reasons and some reasons that aren't so good. But let's turn to today. And if you watched the battery day a couple of weeks ago with Tesla, there was a question after the presentation about V2G, and Elon Musk basically said, V2G, it's better to have a Tesla and a Powerwall rather than taking the current out of the car. It's better to have a car and a battery. And you can understand Mr. Musk's logic there. He builds cars and he builds batteries, and it just as soon sell one of each as he would sell just the car. So from a business standpoint, you can understand his outlook on that. And also he's got a pretty big business going, creating grid scale batteries. They announced, Tesla working with PG&E announced this battery installation that's going in at Moss Landing. It's 730 megawatt hours. It's claimed to be the world's largest battery storage facility. And these are called, what are they called again? Mega powers or something like that. But they're much bigger versions of the Powerwall. And they didn't give too many details on it. And I'm not sure he's using batteries similar to the ones he puts in his cars or not. But if he was using the cells that he puts in the Model 3 and the Model Y, there'd be about 43 million of those cells in this battery. And they also didn't say how much it cost. I have to think it was in the range of $200 million, maybe more, maybe a little less, I'm not sure, but something like that, just based on dollars per kilowatt hour. And they didn't mention the cost in the press material that accompanied this release, but they did say that over 20 years it would save $100 million in various kinds of costs. And I'm not sure if that's the savings after the cost of the installation, or if that's just the total savings, and the cost is almost certainly more than $100 million. But in any case, it's a pretty significant, pretty amazing installation. And it's sort of in competition with V2G because you can, the grid doesn't care where the batteries are or what kind of batteries are, or how big they are. It just cares how much electricity is available and when. And so these kinds of grid scale batteries are basically performing a very similar function to what can be achieved with vehicle to grid. The day after Battery Day, Governor Newsom signed an executive order basically saying that California would only allow the sale of electric vehicles or non-combustion vehicles, I guess, after 2035, 15 years from now. And so this is a pretty bold step by Newsom. I think partly he's pushing back against Washington's effort to take away California's ability to set its own standards by doubling down on their own standards. And it may also be something he's planning to position himself to run for president against Kamala Harris 4 years from now. But it also has it's a pretty significant factor in the, moving forward with EVs. And it would be great if it really happened. I don't really think it will. And you can sort of get a reality check from what happened with the ZEV mandate. Now, way back in 1990, the Air Resources Board mandated EVs, and it was a staged rollout which ended up with 10% EVs by 2003. Turned out a little bit differently. There was a lot of pushback, a lot of technical problems, a lot of political problems. And so they started revising it, and it became massively complex with partial credits and credits for gasoline cars and all kinds of stuff. And today it's still very complex, but basically the requirements translate to ZEVs being about 8% of sales in 2025. So from 1990 to 2025, that's 35 years, we went from 0% to 8%, which is a significant accomplishment in my mind, knowing how things started out. But it's pretty far from being 100% by 2035. So I don't think 100% by 2035 will happen, but it's quite possible that a very significant shift could happen because so many automakers now are building EVs and planning to build EVs. There'll be a huge number on the market. And because of the investment they're putting into these EVs, there's a pretty good chance that they'll want and try pretty hard to sell them. So what might happen in 15 years, I don't think the 100% goal, which would be about 2 million EV sales per year in California, I don't think we'll get close to that. But we might get what I call a 50% scenario, which would end up with about 4.6 million BEVs on the road by 2035. That's the result of a ramp up in sales over time and ending up at 1 million EV sales in California in 2035. And if we had that many EVs, V2G could become very real because the amount of batteries on wheels would really be significant. But as I've learned over the years, V2G going mainstream is kind of hard. You really have to have OEM and utilities supporting it, since they really control the supply of cars and the supply of electricity. If they're against it, it's just not going to happen. There may be reasons they're against it, but they have to be incentivized or regulated or in some way convinced that they will allow and support V2G. The infrastructure itself has to change. Fast chargers, which cost a lot of money being spent to install them, they have their pluses, but they aren't really good for V2G. What you need for V2G is a large number, very large number of chargers, so that anytime you plug in your car, or really anytime you park your car, there's a plug available for you to connect to the grid so that you can be available to provide grid support. As I mentioned, the technology is pretty far along already. There's cars out there with bidirectional power. There's off-board chargers, DC chargers that can do bidirectional power. Professor Kempton, I mentioned, he's been developing aggregation protocols, and so have other companies that allow a wide number of EVs or any kind of power sources spread throughout the grid area be controlled individually, but in a way that meets the needs of the grid as a whole. So pulling many small distributed resources together and aggregating them so that they can act like a significant resource on the grid is very important. There have to be business models that see to it that people who work on this and spend money on it also make money on it, and that includes the person who owns the batteries, because that's a very important part of the picture. So you're not going to let your battery of your EV be used if you don't get any benefits. And finally, there have to be standards and regulations. Those take quite a bit of time. You may recall how long it took to get a standardized EV charging plug developed. We went through various iterations, and we still have 2 plugs. We have the the CCS, and we have Teslas, and then there's another one in Europe and another one in China. So we still haven't even come that far, but we do need standards and regulations that cover a pretty broad area, at least statewide and probably nationwide, to really make V2G viable. But if we got all that, here's a little chart that says, I tried to fill in all the blanks, but only got some of them, but it kind of shows how things have changed from 1990 to today, and then how they might change on into 2035. The population in California has gone from about 30 million to 40 million, probably be around 45, 46 million in 2035. The number of cars on the road, I couldn't get historic numbers, but currently it's about 27 million, and probably go up from there to maybe 30 million in 2035. Actual new car sales has kind of plateaued over the last few years and may not pick up again because of ride sharing and other factors. So just call it steady at 2 million new LDV sales, light duty vehicle sales. And as I said, with a 50% scenario, that would mean 1,000 battery electric vehicle sales in 2035. That's up from 90,000 projected for this year. And then the total number of EVs on the road was 0 in 1990. It was about 4,000 or so. This is California. In 2005, it's about 250,000. Again, these are pure EVs. Most of them are Teslas in California today. And as I showed earlier, if we're selling 1 million cars a year by 2035, that means there'd probably be around 4.6 million vehicles on the road. And each one of those would have a battery, and we can only guess what the capacity would be, but I'm saying conservatively that they went from 16 kilowatt hours in the earliest EVs to maybe 20 in 2005, and maybe 40 on average today, maybe a little higher. And they could go quite a bit higher than 50 by 2035, but I think the days of big batteries will start to fall back, and people will see an economic sweet spot from an awful lot of cars that maybe at about 50 or 60 kilowatt hours per car on average. So if you take the number of cars, the number of cars, 4.6 million, and the kilowatt hours per car at 50 kilowatt hours, you get quite a few kilowatt hours, but they're not all going to be available for V2G. In fact, maybe very few will, but I think that half the cars would participate. And of those half of the cars, maybe 25%, or half of those would be available at any given time to participate. That means to be parked and plugged in to a V2G plug. So 25% of those kilowatt hours might be available at any given time. And if you do the arithmetic, that comes out to 57,500 kilowatt hours of, megawatt hours, 57,500 megawatt hours of energy storage available from the 25% of the cars that are plugged in and available. So in 2035, if you had V2G, you'd have 4.6 million BEVs on the road, and you'd have 57,500 megawatt hours of distributed fast response storage from vehicle to grid. Now, if you don't have V2G in 2035, you'd have the same 4.6 million BEVs, but to get the same battery storage benefit on the grid, you need 78 of those Moss Landing 730 megawatt hour battery installations installed in California. That means we'd have to build over 5 a year. Wow. And you think about how many batteries that is, and disregarding whether we can build 5 a year, the one in Moss Landing has been in planning and construction since 2018 and will be finished sometime next year. If we could do that, would there even be enough battery production capacity? You heard Mr. Musk talk about how they're scrambling just to get enough batteries to build the cars. But could you actually build the same number of cars and the same number, an equivalent number of Moss Landings? Would there be enough battery capacity? I think that's a very serious question. So to summarize, there are really big six big questions for vehicle to grid, and sort of the most basic, and it really comes down to an economic proposition, is how much is energy storage worth? there are a lot of different values for energy storage. I've listed some of them here, from resilience, which is a very general term, but just makes the grid more robust in the event of blackouts or brownouts. Demand response, peak shaving, spinning reserves, energy arbitrage, frequency regulation, investment deferral. All these have a different value, and the nature of the value is different. Some of these have value just by having batteries stand by, even if the batteries aren't used. Of course, those would be very attractive to the EV owner because they get paid for doing nothing, basically, or not doing nothing 90% of the time. So that's a big question. Right now, the value is basically established by the grid operator in a region and the utilities and the Public Utilities Commission. And if you look around the country, the values, the rates, and the tariffs for these kinds of different services all vary widely. So it's not really a market economy yet, and that creates problems for investors who want to understand how much they're going to make if they invest in this. So who will be deciding how to value energy storage is a big question. Who will design the V2G infrastructure? Right now, it's one way, and we're seeing the direction towards fast charging and not that much public infrastructure. And it needs to go in a different direction for V2G. Who will run this whole operation? Who will pay for it? And eventually, who gets the money? Now, I mentioned the drivers have to get something for plugging their cars in and using their batteries, but there are a lot of other people involved too who'll be putting money in. And so how it all gets divided up is pretty important. So I don't have answers to any of these questions. I've been chattering on here for quite a while. So that's kind of the end of where I am, more questions than answers. But you can see that as the number of EVs increases, the sort of appeal and compelling value of all those batteries on wheels that are parked as often as not, or more often than are being driven, will come to represent a very significant potential asset for the grid. So I can take questions now or afterwards. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, we could have a couple of questions now. I think there's been a lot of terms and abbreviations that there are some people who are letting us know that they don't know, but we're not going to have time to explain all of them. But if there are a couple of questions, we could ask Tom now. I think the biggest question, of course, is who is preventing it. So if you could just name, like, quickly, just the three main obstacles from happening right now.
Beverly, since my talk is going to cover the same things, maybe we should
okay.
save the questions until after I've talked too,
okay.
and we can share the answers.
Okay, great. Sure. Okay. Somebody asked something about school buses. We in Santa Cruz County have, well, actually it's going to be in the region. There will be 31 school buses delivered, and they all have V2G capacity. But the sales guy wasn't sure if they were the ones that we were going to have delivered will actually have them in it. And they're perfect because they're operating a very short time and will be sitting much of the time and could be available for the V2G. So that would be something in the future. And I think, Tom, also you're consulting with a truck company about having the fleet be available for V2G?
Yes, there's any number of opportunities out there. I'm working with several of them. And it's still really in the nature of demonstration projects because really to make economic sense and to get enough infrastructure installed to make it worthwhile, people want to see a much larger scale. So that's where these questions come in. You need to have a large number of vehicles that are equipped to do it, and you need a large number of charge stations that are also equipped. And you need to get utilities to agree to accept this kind of power being injected into the grid. I think Jose will probably have quite a bit of additional information about this, and maybe we can talk afterwards.
Great, thank you, Tom. Yeah, so we'll go on to Jose, and at the end we can have questions for the two of you to answer. So Jose, I see Will on the screen. Where's Jose?
I'll bring
There we
up
go.
my screen. Okay.
There you go. Great. So Jose is going to present to us about what exactly we're leading up to here with the V2G technology. What do we want to do with it? They have some technology that, well, he'll tell you about it. They have some technology to aggregate the vehicles and the battery storage to be available for the grid. And Jose has his PhD from Rochester University and Rockefeller University, pardon me, university, and has a number of patents to do with, you would tell us, what's your patents to do with?
Patents are actually mostly on medical things, because I used to be in the cancer diagnostics world.
And so the other thing that Jose is up to right now is that he is an intervener. Is that the right word?
The right word, yes.
An intervener with the California Public Utilities Commission. He's representing the customers because the large investor-owned utilities such as PG&E come in and they have their big lawyers and that to represent them. And he's trying to make a case for local renewable generation with this virtual power plant. So tell us about it, Jose.
So I'm basically addressing one of the use cases that Tom Gage talked about, which is energy arbitrage. Specifically, an issue which is very much on the forefront of the thinking of the PUC is the issue that they refer to as the duck curve. And what the duck curve is, why am I not going forward? There we are. The duck curve is the issue about when electricity is necessary to support the grid. And the organization that manages the grid, called CAISO, the California Independent Systems Operator, every day publishes this curve about when electricity is needed. And the green curve is the total demand of electricity over the course of the day. So it's the lowest in the early morning hours, in the middle of the night, really. And then it rises in the morning, and then it actually rises to the highest peak in the early evening. But what they're really concerned about is what they call the net demand, what they call net demand in excess of renewables. So because there's so much solar power in California now, the net demand that has to be met by generators other than solar and wind actually falls in the middle of the day. And then as the sun sets, it rises up very rapidly. And this is what they call the duck curve. And where did that term come from? Well, in the olden days, before there was any renewable power in California at all, the highest demand was in the middle of the day. And then as more and more solar came to be installed, the demand in excess of renewables got lower and lower in the middle of the day and started to shoot up in the evening. So somebody in Kaiser said, oh my gosh, our demand curve is looking like the back of a duck. And so that term stuck. And now everybody who's involved in managing the grid agonizes about the duck curve, specifically this ramp, where in the early evening, the requirement for power other than renewable power ramps up very quickly. And this, which is the other curve that CAISO publishes every day, is sort of the reverse of that. This is supply, right? So the green lines here is renewables. So at night, the only renewable power California has is from windmills. And then come the morning, the solar, plants come on. And during the day, solar is typically, at least if it's a sunny day, is the biggest source of power in California. But then in the evening, solar rolls off. And then the natural gas, the orange is natural gas plants, have to ramp up. And also the imports that California imports from out of state have to ramp up. Some of those are actually coal. It's a little bit of a goof. California likes to boast that it has no coal plants, but actually some of the imports that we buy from other states are coal. A few other things to note here. This line, which is dead flat, never changes, that's the one nuclear power plant. one of the downsides of a nuclear power plant is you can't adjust it. So even though there's this rapid roll-off and a need to rapidly increase other things, you can't turn a nuclear plant up and down. Another thing to note, this is the zero line here, and you see these little blips here on the zero line. It's not perfectly smooth. That's the total installed battery capacity we have right now. So when we said, oh, you know, Moss Landing, the difference between that little blip and this curve here is how much battery capacity we'd have to install to avoid having to ramp up these gas plants. So, you know, Tom pointed out we'd have to install a lot of Moss Landing. That gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So the problem is, you know, how can the state achieve 100% renewable energy? Because that's the official goal of the state, right? We're supposed to go to 100% renewable energy. Solar is by far the cheapest source of energy. It's cheaper than natural gas. It's cheaper than anything we can buy, but it's not available at night. And even wind is unreliable. There are nights. I mean, this is a day when the wind was pretty steady, but there are days when there's no wind at night. Enough batteries, as Tom pointed out, would be tens of billions of dollars. So I did basically the same calculation that Tom did and came to basically the same thing. The calculation I did starts from this. California has an official goal to have 5 million electric cars by 2030. That's official state policy, and the intent is to have incentives that will achieve that. So start with the assumption that California will achieve that. And then I made the assumption that they're going to have the battery capacity of a Tesla. So I assumed 75 kilowatt hours per car. And let's assume that we're not using fast chargers at all, that all of them can only charge and discharge via a level 2 charger, basically what you might have in your home. The combined power, if they can all get to a level 2 charger, is 37,000 megawatts. If they were all willing to discharge 15% of their battery capacity, he assumed 25%, but I'm taking 15%, but I get to a combined capacity of 55,000 megawatt hours, approximately the same number he came up with. At current prices, that represents $11 billion worth of batteries. Again, you know, if we're going to buy all these cars, we've already paid for a lot of batteries, is the short version of that. So if we take those numbers and we go back to the same curve I showed you before, if this is the tail of the duck that we're so concerned about, the height of the tail, if you will, is only 9,000 megawatts. And we said that, you know, if there's that many level 2 chargers, that would be 37,000 megawatts. That's only 28% of it. In other words, we only need to assume that 28% of the cars are plugged in to completely cut off the tail of the duck. The area under this curve is 44,000 megawatts. So 15% of the battery capacity of 5 million cars would be more than enough to cut off this entire part of the duck. And we don't need to do that. We just need to make this curve slope a little bit. So again, this is a very trivial sort of back of the envelope model. I'm modeling the whole state as, you know, one thing, and I'm making very basic assumptions, but it shows that we're well within the ballpark, which is what I wanted to show. I'm not the only one who done this. I mean, Tom did basically the same kind of modeling. I've done this based on a different number of cars, but came out with a very similar result. This is actually from a much more sophisticated study that was done by Berkeley. They assumed 3 million cars. They only assumed the capacity of a Chevy Volt. And they did, let me see what they assumed. This curve, the green curve, is assuming that they have L2s at home and L1s at work. And controlled V2G means that there's some smarts determining when they charge and when they discharge. And the curves to look at here, here's the original duck curve, shoots up in the evening. The red is what would happen if the cars are completely stupid about when they charge and discharge. As soon as you get home, you plug it in and it starts sucking power off the grid. It actually makes the duck curve worse. The green curve is what happens if you have managed charging. That is, they're actually putting power onto the grid in the evening and then charging themselves later in the evening. And they come to the same conclusion that Tom came to and that I come to. We can basically clip the tail off the duck by V2G. And in this case, they only assume 3 million cars. So in any assumptions you make, the basic conclusion is there's more than enough battery capacity to deal with this issue without having to build a huge number of Moss landings. And then, so the other question that Tom addressed was, how do you manage this? And there's actually companies working on this. NDEW is a local company in San Diego who actually is working with, I think, a license from the group in Baltimore, was it? Who first did the modeling of this. The concept they have is that they would act as what's called an aggregator. So they have a central computer which is talking to these charging stations. So there's an assumption that the charging stations have a little bit of extra circuitry. They can speak to the internet. And NDEW would receive signals from the market, presumably from CAISO, that would say the grid needs power. And then they would distribute messages to however many vehicles are plugged in at the moment and ask them to send power. Or if the grid had surplus power, say in the middle of the day, when at this point there's so much power that on the wholesale market, there's times when the price of electricity actually goes negative. I don't think people realize that. And then they would signal to cars, now's a good time to charge yourself. And the concept is that people would be members of this network and their cars would charge or discharge at the time most advantageous to the grid. NDEW would essentially, from the point of view of the grid, that is from the point of view of the grid operator, NDEW looks like a gigantic power plant and they're selling electricity onto the grid. And then presumably they're passing along some of the profit to the owners of the vehicles. And the university did some significant modeling about, how you would do that, whether you have an auction, whether you pay people a flat rate. And there's, I think Tom mentioned that, people might get a few $100s, potentially a month, for being connected. So it could be a non-trivial thing. And they thought about the issue of, are people going to be wanting to do this every day? They have the concept that you'd have an app or something where you could, when you plugged in your car, you could say whether you're willing to give up charge or even how much charge you're willing to give up. So if you thought you were going to make a long road trip tomorrow, you could say, oh, tonight I'm not willing to sell anything. Or you could say, yeah, today I'm willing to discharge my battery to this level. Or in a more sophisticated scheme, you could even say, I'm willing to sell power if you offer me this much, but you have to reach this threshold before I'll sell power. You could imagine schemes where there's actually a bidding going on. But in any case, NDEW has this concept that it's almost like a social media app or something where you get to say, what you're willing to sell. In any case, they've already developed these things. They're already prototyping them in Europe. So they're working on that. Now, the other aspect of this, well, let me speak to why somebody would do this, all right? Step one is the integrator, and NDEW is not the only company doing this. They just happen to be the one that gave me permission to use their slides. Presumably the integrator is making money selling, buying power when it's cheap and selling it when it's expensive. And in order to make this work, they have to share some of the revenue with the owners of the EVs. But there's another big advantage to the owner of the EV. Most of the time when the EV is giving up charge, it's in the evening. The evening is when the time of use rates are the very most expensive. So the effect on the user of the owner's bill is that the owner's meter is either running backwards or at least not running forwards as fast during the evening. So they're saving on their electric bill over and above whatever they get for participating in this scheme that reduces the duck curve. The owner's usage in their house from the point of view of the grid is lower. So there's a savings on their individual bill. There's been a concern about using up the charger. Well, actually, let me just something else. There's also this resiliency issue. as an earlier speaker described, the EV can be a source of power when the grid is down. And this presumably would become a more, something you wouldn't have to build on your own. It would become a more standardized thing. One other thing that wasn't mentioned is that in a long power outage, you can drive an EV somewhere else, charge it, and then drive it back to your house. The other thing is, there's been some concern about, is this going to run down the battery? Well, first of all, the batteries are getting longer life. But second of all, this is assuming, in that modeling, I assume that you'd never discharge any vehicle more than 15%. And NUV and the other companies doing this are assuming that the algorithm would never discharge any vehicle down to a very low level. And that's really what kills battery life, is deep discharges. So this could be done to have minimal impact on the battery life. So I just want to make a plug for our organization. Our observation is that what's going on right now is that despite the evidence that V2G could have a big impact on saving the state from having to buy a lot of resources, right now the PUC isn't giving V2G a lot of thought. And the PUC is right now engaged in what they call the integrated resource planning. So it's important that it get attention right now. So, and the CCA is an intervener, which means that we get to put documents before the PUC, and they don't have to listen to us. Well, they have to listen to us. They don't have to do what we say, but they legally have to at least pay attention to what we say. So we're going to hold a conference in early 2021 on, can V2G alleviate the duct curve? That is, we're going to focus on this one question about the shifting of load from the day to the night, or from the night to the day. All of you are, by the way, invited. I get a list of people who called into this, which hopefully Beverly will have. You'll all get an invitation to attend this for free. It'll be a Zoom conference. And the results of this conference will be presented to the PUC as a policy paper. I'll also, if I get your names, invite you to join the CCE. We have rights to appear before the PUC because we're a membership organization of ratepayers in California. And there's our webpage. In any case, so to what Tom said about the policy, there is a need to create, at this point, my take on this is that the regulatory issues are the single biggest obstacle to V2G being a reality in California. And we're trying to use our position as interveners to, get our oar in and push for this. So, we can ask for your support, and we will, ask you to listen to our conference, and we'll have some people from, people who've been working on this, like the ones whose papers I showed you, and we're going to push this in the PUC and see how far we get. Anyway, now I will stop and ask for questions, both of us.
Thank you, Jose. Do you want to say something very quickly about the peaker plants, that this is also designed?
Well, yeah, what I showed you on that curve is that what's happening right now, where is that here? In the evening right now, this roll-off in solar is being met by ramping up these natural gas plants. And they're relatively inefficient when they're run this way, to only run them a few hours in the evening. And the debate that's before the PUC right now is, are the owners of these plants going to be allowed to run them indefinitely as a supplement to solar power? There's actually an argument before the PUC that even when California goes to 100% solar power, and even if it had all these batteries, there could be a time when there's, several days of cloudiness and the batteries might run down, and therefore you still have to pay the plants to be on backup. And there's already plants that hardly ever run. I mean, presumably some number of plants are running almost every day. But there's plants in California that are only run like 40 hours a year or something. And they still get payments for what's called resource adequacy, which is the technical term for what you might call backup. And that's a pretty expensive thing. And that is something. The other thing, and Tom mentioned this briefly, is the concept that in as much as every utility is required to have backup power, over and above whatever you might get paid for, partially discharging your car's battery, if you were willing to say, okay, I'll let you discharge 15% of my battery capacity, but if there were an emergency, you could take another 20%, but that might only happen once a year, you get paid for that also. And that would allow the state to completely retire a whole bunch of plants that right now the state is basically paying to keep idle. So there's a double benefit there over and above just this business about shifting load. That's the second one of the, Tom showed a list of 6 things that you can do with a battery. That's the second one. That's what's called resource adequacy. I haven't even talked about some of the other things Tom talked about, like frequency regulation, which is the making power available on a very quick basis to meet very short-term requirements of the grid, which is something that NEW is already doing in certain pilot projects. So this is what's called a stacking of benefits, where you get paid for various things. Some of these things are would require more regulatory changes than others, and therefore I haven't even thought about the the relative benefits of those others. I mean, for instance, to get recognized as spinning reserve would require changes in the PUC rules over and above the changes that would be required to recognize that the cars are discharging, charging in the day and discharging in the evening. So there's this, like a series of regulatory steps. But I'm at the moment focused on the duck curve because that's something that there's a lot of angst about. And also is the one that's going to be hugely expensive. As he pointed out, the number of Moss landings that would be needed. We're looking at, tens of billions of dollars. So that's really the big nut. So that's the issue there.
Thank you, Jose. We have about 7 or 8. We have 8 minutes left, and if any people have questions, and I'm willing to stay over. I don't know if the other people who are presenting or the people who are presenting are willing to stay over and answer questions. But Michael, you're willing to stay? Is that what you're raising your hand about?
I have a question.
You have a question? Okay. Go.
Yeah, so under the ideal world of being able to level out the demand curve or the net demand curve with some form of batteries, whether it's the very large systems that Tesla is putting in and other companies, or an ideal world where we had 4 million Teslas that are vehicle to grid capable. A lot of people are arguing, and of course I read green tech media, and I think they try to keep a delicate balance between renewables and the interests of companies like Duke Energy, for example, who argue that there is a minimum level of base load that we have to have, either from nuclear or fossil fuel plants.
My take on this is that baseload is an obsolete concept because renewables can provide the total amount of energy we need. They just don't provide it in a completely predictable way. So what's needed is not so much things like nuclear plants that have the disadvantage that you can't adjust them. What's needed is things like batteries that can absorb energy when you have too much and give it up when you need it. So really, we're better off giving up on the idea of base load and inflexible things like coal plants and nuclear plants, and looking at a dynamic management of the grid where we have, many things that make energy when they can, and then batteries as a way to manage it. The other side of that is what's called demand management, is that, many automated systems that respond to signals from the grid to turn themselves off when needed. There's a whole industry of those things too. Does that answer the question?
Any other question?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Jose. Are there any other questions?
How much of this will be available in after the presentation as a recording or as PowerPoint slides for download?
I'm writing that into the chat right now. Yes, it's being recorded. It will be available sometime, someplace. We're not sure yet. And what I was typing into the chat, which I will send right now, is that we've had some breakdowns with regard to registration. So some of you, many of you, actually, well, some of you I haven't seen on our list at the National Drive Electric Week site. So then I wouldn't have access to your email. So I put my email in the chat, and you can also find us on Facebook. You can message me there. And we'll send to you where it will be available.
I can send the slides directly if you get me a list, Beverly.
That's part of the issue, and I don't know why the message actually went, instead of going to everyone, it went to one person. That's the issue that I'm addressing, is that some people did not show up as having been registered, even though they told me they had registered, and even Michael Mora was one of them. So I'm giving my email address, and you can contact us if I am unable to contact you, like if you don't hear from us after a couple of weeks. There we go, to everyone. There's my email. We're also on Facebook, EAA-CCC, Electric Auto Association of the Central Coast, on Facebook. We have a page there. Are there any pressing questions to anyone else? We have 4 minutes left.
Let me know if you want to come to Idaho and present. Get the ball rolling there. Won't be a challenge at all. You only live next to a nuclear plant. I'll try.
So I wanted to say something if nobody's got a question. That's usually the first question that gets asked, is it going to destroy our batteries? And as Jose is saying, if you're only taking 15%, but depending on where in the battery cycle you're taking 15% from, it's thought to be at both ends of when it's full or when it's empty. It's not good to be taking power. Also, quick charging is a destroyer of batteries, and shelf life. Those are the three factors that are most influencing battery life at this point, from something we've heard. This is the latest that's being talked about.
Battery life was the big question when we started off with V2G, and now we're hearing people talk about million-mile batteries, which I don't know how true that is, but there's no million-mile cars, so you might as well use the battery for something. And I think that's just going to be diminishing. And what you said, Beverly, is true, that you can certainly manage where in the SOC curve you take the energy from, and charges and discharges in the middle range of SOC seem to have almost no effect on battery life. So it's a valid concern, but I think it's diminishing in terms of how big a factor it really will be in V2G.
Yeah, one of the all the companies like NDEW that are designing these systems have the smarts to detect the battery state of charge and try to do the things that will, be the lightest on the battery. So remember, they're doing this statistically. The assumption is that there's millions of cars that they're dealing with. So when they're calling on it, they'll just not call on the cars whose battery would be harmed by whatever they do.
There was another big question that came in a forum back and forth with a statewide coalition for community choice aggregators. And one of the biggest things was that, well, it's really not a stable thing. They're just not going to be available. And I'm wondering if part of the model would be that people would have perhaps certain agreements that they would, be, well, people are usually charging at the same times. They're either charging in the middle of the day to collect the solar, or they're charging at night. So those are stable, but would there be some type of agreements with those vehicles who have agreed to participate?
I don't think it's necessary to have formal agreements. If you have enough people, then you can do it statistically. I mean, there's lots of industries that work on the basis of we have many customers and we can predict what's going to happen just on the basis of that. That's the whole theory of the insurance industry. It's in fact the theory of the banking industry. So I think there's no reason that a company like NDEW that wants to be an aggregator can't enter the market and commit to delivering this much power on the basis of we have this many customers and on the average they behave like this, and we'll take some derating factor off that and just commit to this delivery. And they don't have to get individual customers to promise to plug in their cars from this hour to that hour. They just do it statistically. It's the law of large numbers. And there's lots of industries who base their whole economic model on that.
Costco model.
You can get some idea of the statistics of just think, well, how many cars are parked at any given time?
Mm-hmm.
And if half of those cars are electric, it's a huge number. And the number of cars parked at any one time is pretty predictable over a 24-hour period.
And cars are usually parked about 95% of the time. We're only using them a very short period of time, unless that's your business is driving somewhere. But so I just want to let people know it's 6 o'clock now. For those who need to go, for those who want to stay, I'm willing to stay. I could talk about this all day. I'm so happy with the presentations. Thank you all very much for presenting, and thank you all to the participants for coming and supporting this transition. We are in transition to a renewable world, and it's so very exciting, and all of these things that we've talked about today are all part of that. And once we get done raking our forests, we'll be in really good shape with regards to climate change around here with all of this new technology. So thank you, everyone. And I'm willing to stay. Whoever's willing to stay and ask or answer.
I've got to go now. This is Tatanka, but thank you, Beverly, for telling me about this. This has been great. Thank you for the presenters, and I'll be tapping on you, Beverly, and the presenters for the California Green New Deal, Romero, we're putting together.
Thanks.
So thanks a lot. This is terrific.
Thank you, Tatanka.
Okay.
I'd like to put in a plug. This is Michael. I'd like to put in a plug for, of all things, PG&E. They offer an excellent series of courses online, which they've done for years through the Pacific Energy Center, pgne.com. You can, just tunnel down to Pacific Energy Center classes, and they're on all sorts of things like renewables, building envelope efficiency, heat pumps, etc. So it's free. The ratepayers are paying for it. And it's a great way to get educated at whatever level you're at technically, from completely uninformed about renewables to maybe you're an engineer, but there's everything in between. So I highly recommend it.
Thanks, Michael. Any other questions? We haven't. John, were you checking the chat for questions?
Yeah, not too many directly at this point.
So I'm just curious. I think, Michael, you mentioned being an electrical contractor. Is your company available for like consumer work or?
I'm retired. I do a little bit of consulting, and I've got, one municipal customer I still take care of about, once or twice a month, driving from Santa Cruz County over to Silicon Valley. But that's about my limit now. I'm willing to talk to people or advise. I do a lot of that for friends, pro bono.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because I'm in Santa Cruz and I'd love some advice on a project if you're advising.
Okay.
We have to
I don't know how to get connected. I'm not sure how to. What's your name?
My name's Brad. Beverly knows how to reach
I
me.
can connect you up. Something else
we can start from there.
Yeah, something else I wanted to mention is that for those people who don't have EVs yet, or those people who are looking for new EVs, Plug-in America guide. They have a guide of all the EVs that are available, and even can offer you a consultation. And Sierra Club has it as well. And there are lots of different resources. What are you mouthing, Will? electricautoassociation.org. electricauto.org is the Electric Auto Association's website. Pluginamerica.org is theirs. sierraclub.org is theirs. And there are great resources on all of those pages. And we will definitely...
Sorry, Plug-in America uses Plugstar, but it's an excellent site. It allows you to look at all EVs and compare them. It's very good.
And when we figure out the technology, we will try to make sure that we have captured all of the emails of those people who have been here. Nobody, even at the national level, has figured out yet how to exactly capture that, but we will work on that and make sure that you're invited to Jose's symposium in January.
By the way, I'm in the market for an electric pickup truck, all-wheel drive, with at least a 250-mile range. So if anyone has a recommendation about whatever is coming up in the next year or so, please chew my ear off with it. Thank you.
There's a Cybertruck coming up soon. Rivion's coming up soon. The Ford 150's coming up soon. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've done it here. So again, I thank you all and have a good evening. National Drive Electric Week is still happening one more day. If you go to driveelectric.org, you'll find the events that are happening tomorrow. And then that's the end of our week. And it's been a great, so many really interesting webinars. And we got to visit everybody else's